Hello, and welcome to Week 3, Chapter 3, Transportation Regulation and Public Policy. The last couple of weeks, we have discussed in this class two very important aspects to transportation: the critical link in its supply chain and the critical link in the local and regional and global economy. As we go into this week's chapter, we're looking at transportation's regulation and its relationship with public policy as it is deemed by the government. Let's look at this week's chapter objectives that will help us understand what we're supposed to be looking for this week. So we're going to understand that there are several bases for regulations of transportation in the U.S. We have to appreciate the roles of regulatory agencies and the courts in regulating transportation, obtain a knowledge of previous and current regulations that affect transportation. We need to understand why there is a need for a national transportation policy, and identify and assess the needs and the roles of public promotion in transportation, and appreciate the role of user charges, and then obtain a knowledge of transportation safety and security regulations to the United States. If you work in any corporation or company right now, you probably are familiar or have even worked in some of the aspects with public policy or governmental regulations. No matter where you're working, it's Department of Defense or just a small private corporation. You know, government policy and regulations play a huge role in everyday business. As we look at that, let's look at something that the book points out at the very beginning. I want to again just read you a small excerpt from page 56. We are going to look at the basis of regulations along with the roles of the regulatory commissions in the courts. As we talk about the development of transportation regulation from its inception at the federal level, out of the way in 1887 until its role today, will be presented. We're going to look at the national transportation policies directing and promoting transportation and national security. So now we know which direction we're going in with this chapter. So as we talk about the regulation of transportation, we talk about the nature of it. So in our wonderful United States, the government influences the activities of industries in many different ways. And we have the amount of influence in industry activity, and it varies forth providing the legal foundation and the framework in which industries operate to government ownership and control of firms in some industries. As we look at this, we think about pure competition. It mentions that as well as how it provides our marketplace that's desirable to consumers. And sometimes monopolies develop, and those are not very popular, nor do they really contribute to the consumer competition. But as we think about that, we think that our basic challenges, especially as we try to regulate in our society, we want to establish or maintain the conditions necessary for the economic use of resources under a system of private enterprise. But regulation, its main goal needs to look at maintaining the competitive framework and then rely on competitive forces whenever possible. So again, we think about the institutional framework is also to regulate transportation that's provided by a federal statute. So the perspective on the overall legal basis for regulation is very important for us to understand how that's going to affect everything. So the book goes ahead and talks about common law, and the legal system in the U.S. is basically based upon the common law, after civil statutory law. As we look at the common law approach, it fits in well with the free market society perspective because the individual is to focus the attention and can engage in any business that's not prohibited. And then as we look at statutory law, that's a civil law, and it's based upon the Roman legal system, and it still is popular in Europe. And statutory law is enacted by the legislative bodies, but is also a specific enactment. And then we also have state regulations that come into play, as well as something called the Granger laws that actually came into existence in the 1870s because of the development of the railroad industry that needed them to have more of a statutory regulation. And that has kind of went into other modes of transportation too as well. And we also will be introduced to what the Interstate Commerce Commission has in its role in the independent regulatory commissions. You will study more about the Surface Transportation Bound. The U.S. Department of DOT is still considered to be the independent regulatory agency. We also think about, you'll be studying about the Civil Aeronautics Board, the Federal Marine Commission, and the Federal Energy Regulation Commission as well, and the role of the courts at times in transportation policy. Now, the courts are actually the sole determinants of the intent of the law, and only court decisions can serve as legal precedent under common law. Very interesting concept. As we talk about the safety regulations, you're going to be hearing a lot in this chapter about the Federal Aviation Administration, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, the National Highway Traffic Safety Commission, the Federal Railroad Administration, the Coast Guard, the Pipeline and Hazardous Material Safety Administration, and the National Transportation Safety Board. All these entities were created to have regulatory laws and statutes to protect and enforce rules and regulations to keep ethical and fairness in the economy and in interstate commerce and business. And sometimes the police powers, if you think back to your American government classes that you've taken in the past, contain the Constitution that exercises various controls over the safe operation of vehicles. Then we talk about state regulations. I just mentioned interstate commerce. It's defined for you on page 61. And we talk more about the development of regulation. There's a table on page 62 and 63 that talks about the chronological order of major transportation regulation all the way from its inception in 1867 to about 2002. And we know even more has changed since this book has been published. And we also think about the current economic regulations. It talks about the Surface Transportation Board, that's a sub-entity within the DOT. And then also they mostly are concerned with the railroad regulations, as well as for motor carriers and freight forwarders and brokers. Those stipulations are listed on page 65 in your textbook. And then we're looking at antitrust laws and the Anti-Sherman Antitrust Act. So now we're looking more into the deregulatory movement that has exposed many unethical practices that can be in violation of the antitrust laws. And when we look at this, the key points of the Act is Section 1, the trust and restraint of trade illegal penalty. Then Section 2 of that is monopolizing trade, a felony penalty. When we looked at 1914, along came the Clayton Act, and it described that some practices that would be interpreted as attempts to monopolize. And that can be like exclusive dealing arrangements. The buyer or seller agrees to deal only with the other party for a period of time. Another prohibited practice is trying to contract out, and that's where the seller agrees to sell goods to the buyer only if the buyer also buys another product from the seller. The FTC actually has a big role in this in legislation-wise. In 1914, the Federal Trade Commission was created because of the inceptions of the Sherman Acts and the Clayton Acts as well. Then there is a collective where that's made by transportation carriers was made exempt from antitrust laws by the passage of the Reed-Bullwinkle Act of 48, and that helped the ICC to oversee carrier rate making. And that's limited traditional jurisdiction by the FTC. Today, carriers are not immune from antitrust regulations as they pertain to the rate bureaus and the freight classifications. And then another major law that can apply deregulation is the Robinson-Patman Act of 1936. And we also have the creation of that, a per se violation in the selling or purchase of transportation services. There's two types of antitrust violations, the per se, and then the second is called the rule of reason. As we think about transportation policy, the federal government plays a large role in it because it wants to create a transportation system in the United States to make it what it is today and to make it even better for future generations. And various laws and rules and funding programs have actually molded the transportation system with the government involvement into what it is today. And why do we need a transportation policy? We may ask ourselves that as professionals in the supply chain field, or we may ask ourselves that as students as we learn more about this. We think about it. Sometimes a good starting point for examining the nature of national transportation policy is consideration of our need for such a policy. And if you're going to answer that question, it's actually in the very significance of transportation to the very life of our country. It's in every aspect of our lives. Think about that. Again, these laws, these acts were created to protect, to keep ethics, to give everybody a free chance in the free market society. Now, again, you're always going to have a little bit of unscrupulous practices, and sometimes too much government can also be a more negative impact than a positive impact. But let's look at this, the Declaration of National Transportation Policy. And in week 3 folder, I believe in the preparation folder, I actually have a couple of links. I believe that will take you to the actual National Transportation Policy website, .gov website. So you might want to check that out as well in your self-study. The ICC Termination Act of 95 included statements in national transportation policies, and Congress made these statements to provide direction for the STB in administering transportation regulation over the railroads, our motor carriers, water, and pipeline. And that is outlined on page 69 and 70. Very interesting to look over. And again, the book kind of talks about the policy interpretations and provisions for air carriers, common carrier obligations, and also even fair wage and working conditions for those people in these industries. But who actually establishes these parties is actually, the policies are actually established by our executive branch of our government. Congressional committees are a big part of that. And then there's our regulatory agencies come into play, as well as our judicial system, where the courts come in, as I mentioned earlier in the lecture. And also industry associations as well. We talk at the end of the chapter, kind of talks about public promotion, of transportation planning in the public sector. I also want you to look over the approach to public project planning analysis. So if you go to work in transportation for a company or corporation, sometimes there's a specific analytical tool that helps you in public planning, and it's called the benefit cost ratio, the BCR. So it's a measure of total measurable benefits to society divided by the initial capital cost. And the formula is listed on page 76. And so I want you to look at that. And they talk again about, we talked about time value. Well, now time value of funds is actually talked about in this chapter. So those are important parts of any kind of capital project analysis. So that's where the BCR comes in. We talk about, we skip over to the air and how domestic air system receives its benefits in several governmental programs. We have the FAA and the air traffic control systems. And we also talk about user charges, and those are designated in whole and part to have the modes pay for many of the public benefits they receive. In motor and highway, we talk about highway development and how the Federal Highway Administration branch and DOT is responsible for federal highway construction and safety. We talk about domestic waterway operations. We've got the Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Coast Guard, and then international water carriage. It's actually managed by the Maritime Administration, MARAD. There's different indirect forms of promotion that exist in the industry. There's cargo preferences, and also the Shipping Act of 1984. They touch a little bit on the pipeline and also transportation promotion in perspective to the user charges on page 82, as well as there's forms in the existence charge, unit charges, and relative case. And that assesses fees according to the investment of the cost incurred by the agency. We talk about nationalization as the extreme form of public promotion, and talks more about transportation safety and security and their standards. So again, as you look, these are just some highlights of this chapter that I want you guys to study a little further. Again, when we talk about transportation safety, we talk about economic deregulation as well as minimum level of safety standards and transportation security, especially after the September 11th attacks. Those things, new Department of DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, has played a major role now. As you read through this chapter, I hope you apply these concepts to your everyday life. Again, if you have any kinds of questions regarding this chapter, please contact me, and I hope you have a great week.